From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Mary Lou Rieker. On behalf of the Office of Scholarly Programs and the John W. Kluge Center and the American Folklife Center, I want to welcome you today to a talk by Deirdre Niconley. And I'm not going to be giving the formal introduction here, but I want to introduce Steve Winnick, who is a folklorist with the American Folklife Center, and he'll give an introduction. Welcome.
Thank you. I am Stephen Winnick from the American Folklife Center, and I think they asked me to introduce Dr. Deirdre Niconley because they sensed that I had a decent chance of pronouncing her surname correctly. It's also possible that they thought no one would manage it, and I was therefore the scapegoat. That we could go with that theory too. So Deirdre Niconley is here at the John W. Kluge Center as an Alan Lomax Fellow in Folklife, doing research on the collections of Sidney Robertson Cowell, who collected Irish traditional music in Deirdre's home community of the Aran Islands during the 1950s. And Cowell's collections are in our archive at the American Folklife Center. And at AFC, we've been very happy to have Deirdre here, and we're grateful to the Kluge Center for this fellowship, because it's always helpful to us when insightful scholars come and do research in our collections. It helps us to learn more about them, and that in turn helps future scholars who are going to be researching these collections for years to come. So Deirdre's detailed knowledge of the Aran Islands community and also of other scholars and collectors who have worked there is really going to add a lot to our knowledge of this collection and to what we can provide to future scholars. So we're really happy that she's been here. It's been a wonderful experience for us. So just to introduce Deirdre, she has a PhD from the music department at University College Cork. In 2010, her dissertation on Aran Islands traditional music won the Adele Dulcimer Prize for Distinguished Dissertation on Irish Studies from the American Conference for Irish Studies. And prior to her fellowship here, she was an NEH Keogh Fellow at the Keogh Naughton Institute for Irish Studies at Notre Dame. She has also done sterling work as a broadcaster, especially on Irish language radio, and she's quite a good fiddler. And I'm pretty sure I've heard her sing a song or two also, but only very late at night at academic conferences. So she is, as they say, an impressive character altogether. So without any more ado, let us welcome Deirdre Niconley.
Bailó Dhearg bhfuair géad fáilte anseo. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and thanks also to the future webcast viewers. It's an honour and a pleasure for me to speak here today. I'd like to thank the Kluge Centre for the opportunity to return to DC and to work in such a welcoming, encouraging, supportive and stimulating environment with talented staff to guide us around this enormous, glorious institution. Not a week has gone by, but I've been wonderstruck at some new discovery, a long sought after book or article or song, and ably and most generously assisted by the fantastically knowledgeable staff throughout the library. The combination of expertise and materials available here is, I imagine, very hard to match. So thank you to our able leaders, Carolyn, Mary Lou, Alicia, Charlita, Jason and Co for your time and energy, and to my fellow scholars in Team Kluge for their winning combination of levity and enlightenment. When the subject of my talk, Sidney Robertson Cowell, donated her papers to the Library of Congress, I don't think she could have envisaged that a descendant of the people she met and worked with in Ireland in the mid-1950s would track her story to this place and end up working here and speaking here. Having that connection with her story makes it all the more tangible to me. So in an effort to share that sense of tangibility with you, I thought I would begin with this image of a postcard that's here in the library in the American Folklife Center. It was sent to Sydney in 1956 by my uncle Sean O'Conneilla, or Sean Conneely as he signed it. Then 16 years old, Sean taught Irish to Sidney. He went on to become an Irish teacher. I'd like to dedicate this talk to his memory because he passed away since I came to America just over a year ago. And I was then, as Steve mentioned, at the University of Notre Dame at the Keownocton Institute for Irish Studies. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to that institute because it too has contributed richly to my current project. I first heard about Sidney Robertson Cowell by chance in May of 2000 whilst listening to an interview on Irish radio with the Professor of History at NUI Galway, Dáithí O'Cronin, who was talking about his recent book on the songs of his grandmother, Bess Cronin. During the interview, Dáithí mentioned that Sidney had recorded in my native county Galway, in Conamara and the Aran Islands. When I asked him about her a few months later, he directed me to this library. And on my first ever visit to America in March of 2001, as a very green postgraduate student, I was enthralled by the materials I found here. I'd like to thank the staff of the Music Division and the American Folklife Centre, especially Kathy Kirst, and Smithsonian Folkways, especially Jeff Place and Stephanie Smith, for maintaining a productive, long-distance working relationship over the last 11 years and 3,000 miles of ocean. What you will learn here today is most definitely the result of a collective effort. Before I launch into the story of Sidney Robertson Cowell's work in Ireland, I need to create for you a context for my discussion. It will include a little geography and history, some historiography, and a brief outline of the book I'm writing here at the library, from which this lecture is drawn. My field of research is Irish traditional music. Researchers in this field tend to be interdisciplinary scholars out of necessity as much as desire, moving between ethnomusicology, folklore, Irish studies, literature in Irish and in English, anthropology, history, and even geography. And I myself came through music departments and latterly through Irish studies. My research is centred on a small archipelago off the west coast of Ireland called the Aran Islands, which lie across the mouth of Galway Bay, that stretch of water immortalised by Bing Crosby, among others. The three main islands are inhabited. Aran, or Inishmore, meaning Big Island, to the northwest is about 9 by 3 miles. Inishmeoin, the middle island, is about 5 by 3 miles. And Inisir, the smallest of the three, lying to the southeast, is about 3 by 1.5 miles. The total population is just over 1,200 people, with just over 800 on Inishmore, around 260 on Inisir, and just 150 or so on Inishmeoin, which is the most inaccessible of the three islands. English is spoken in Aran, as we call it for short, but the everyday language of islanders is Irish or Gaelic. It is a Gaeltacht, or an Irish-speaking area, one of several Gaeltachtaí that are dispersed across the whole island of Ireland, but most of which cling to the western seaboard. The neighbouring mainland area of Conamara to the north of the islands is also Irish-speaking, and together, Conamara and Aran form the largest Gaeltacht in Ireland. Out of around 96,500 people living in Ireland's Gaeltachtaí, 68% of which speak Irish, around half of them, around 49,000, live in the Galway Gaeltachtaí. Archaeologists estimate that Aran has been inhabited for the last 6,000 years, and evidence of how different generations and different tribes have survived and thrived in the islands is abundant in the landscape. Indeed, it is said that there is nowhere in Ireland with a higher concentration of archaeological remains per square mile. This fact combines with the island's fascinating history, with its evocative liminal island location on the edge of Ireland, on the edge of Europe, and on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, and with its spectacular landscape and rich culture to set the stage for what is now Aran's biggest industry, tourism, although there is still some fishing and small-scale farming going on. Tourism brings between 150,000 to maybe 200,000 visitors per annum to the islands, and mostly in the short, intense summer season. This huge flow of people is, however, a very recent development that came about after passenger ferries were first introduced 30 years ago. Before their introduction, life in Aran was very different. My parents, who were children in the 1950s, remember when running water, electricity and telephones were first introduced to island homes, the phones in the 1960s and mainline electricity in 1975. In their day, the number of visitors was closer to 20,000 per annum, so that's around 1/8 of today's figures. Amidst the huge number of people who have visited Aran over the years, there have been scores of writers, poets, artists, photographers, antiquarians, naturalists, linguists, folklorists, filmmakers, broadcasters, and cartographers who have been inspired to contribute to a canon of material about Aran, a canon to which islanders have contributed to most famously as writers and poets. There are two standout works in this canon. The first is a book entitled The Aran Islands that was published in 1907 by the Irish playwright John Millington Synge. And the second is a 1934 documentary film named Man of Aran, directed by the American Robert Flaherty. Both of these stand out not least for their quality, but also because of how they continue to impact on the islands, inspiring others to write their own version of the book, or to reinterpret Flaherty's film, or simply to visit the islands. And just this summer I saw a visitor walking the roads of Inisir with the Penguin edition of Synge's book in his hand. The film Man of Aran is particularly relevant to the story I will be telling you today, but more on that later. The rich canon I've described has an odd anomaly. Considering the cultural importance attached to the Aran Islands and to Irish traditional music in local, national and international contexts, and considering the continuous practice of traditional music in Aran over the last 200 years at least, it's surprising to learn that comparatively little of the Aran canon engages directly with traditional music, or indeed with any genre of music. Of those commentators who were motivated by the music of Aran, their work most often amounted to collection without publication, documentation without dissemination. So music in Aran has been marginalised within the Aran canon and by extension within the wider context of Irish traditional music and Ireland. And this is reflected in the misinformation and assumptions that continue to be made about music in Aran. So the question that inspired my current avenue of research is why? What is the reason for this marginalisation? The issue at stake is representation. How is the music of Aran being represented? Who is representing it, and what are their motives? My project is essentially an exercise in historiography, but I find myself doing a lot of history as well because there's been so little research done on the music of Aran. The question of representation is at the heart of the book I've been working on here at the library, the subject of which is music collecting in Ireland. And this is the earliest known image of song collecting in Ireland, I believe, which is taken from a drawing that was done in a boat off the coast of the Aran Islands, as you can see in 1857. So the book I'm writing makes a number of contributions. It provides a new theoretical framework with which to discuss alternative or unorthodox methods of collecting music. In so doing, it broadens our definitions of the practice of music collecting to include alternative methods alongside more orthodox methods. And this will ultimately enable us to consider more documents of the music of the past, and so expand our knowledge of our musical past. The book focuses on 4 different collections of music from the Aran Islands, collections that span 120 years from the 1850s to the 1970s, and which inhabit a variety of different media, from 19th century manuscripts and drawings to 20th century recordings on acetate discs and magnetic reel-to-reel tapes. Following the stories of 4 different parties as they worked over 2 centuries in the same locality provides my discussion of music collecting in Ireland with a useful common ground upon which to compare and contrast their different motives, methodologies, and representations of a localised music. So today I've chosen to speak about the third of the 4 collections, not least because most of it is housed here at the library, but also because its creator, Sidney Robertson Cowell, has a wonderful and complicated story that needs to be told, as Nicole Saylor put it. The other reasons are Sidney's long association with the library, in particular with the Archive of American Folk Song, and the fact that she was a contemporary, compatriot and sometime colleague of Alan Lomax, the man to whose memory this fellowship I hold is dedicated. This lecture seems to me an appropriate forum to discuss her work publicly, but I know some of you would also like to hear an Irish Lomax Fellow speak about Lomax's work in Ireland. So even though Lomax didn't collect in Aran, I will touch on that other complicated story too. Okay, this is Sidney herself speaking.
Robertson Cowell on home of Mrs. Jerry in Conamara. Testing for noise. August 13th, 1956. Now I'll see what comes on next to the noises of the next room where the family's having dinner.
That's just a little glimpse of, you know, the practicalities of trying to record and testing the sound level. Sidney Robertson Cowell was born in California in 1903 and died in Shady, New York in 1995. She was originally a music teacher, and she enters the narrative of US music collecting at a time of enormous upheaval for America, the Great Depression. Over a career spanning 21 years from 1936 to 1957, she went on to record an astonishing variety of music in the US and in other countries including Canada, Ireland, Iran, East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, and to the best of my knowledge, Thailand and in either Singapore or on the Malay Peninsula. It's very difficult to get exact information on this stuff when there's such an expanse of material. She also published some of the music that she recorded. The extent and diversity of her collecting and the significance of her achievement are, to my mind, comparable, though not commensurate, with that of Alan Lomax. His more well-known exploits, like those of his peer Charles Seeger and of his father John A. Lomax, overshadow memories of Sidney and the other extraordinary women who worked in the same field. So today I can only attempt to tell part of her story, the American chapters of which have already been investigated by Jim Leary, Kathy Kirst, Carl Rakkonen, Peter Stone and Brett Topping, to name a few. My purpose today is to join these authors in helping to establish the significance of Sidney's star in the folk music collecting firmament. My aim is to shed new light on the international dimension of Sidney's work and so bring a fresh perspective to our understanding of her entire oeuvre and of her place in the remarkable and diverse pantheon of American folk music collectors. My focus is on Sidney's first efforts to record overseas. In the summers of 1955 and 56, she created up to 11 hours of recordings, extensive notes and photographs in the west of Ireland, specifically in the Aran Islands and in Conamara. Her Irish work forms a small but significant part of her collected field recordings and writings. I'm going to explain briefly how Sidney became a music collector and ethnomusicologist, one who was driven by fundamental questions about the origins and the purpose of music. I will contextualise her work in Ireland in relation to her early work in the US and ask how and why her methodology was different when she recorded in Ireland. And I'll suggest avenues to future researchers of the work of this indefatigable collector of folk songs, as Ray Corson described her, she who was head of the Archive of Folk Culture here in the 50s and 60s. Sidney was, according to Brett Topping, a talented, productive, capable woman with a highly original personality and lively sense of humour. People in Aran called her the Yank with the box, hence the title of this lecture. Now, I should explain that in Ireland, Yank just means American and ignores the shadow of the Mason-Dixon line. In Conamara, she was called Ban Stocky Darga, the woman of the red stockings, on account of her exotic-looking nylons. She first collected folk music, including Spanish and cowboy songs, in her native California, with the purpose of sharing it with her pupils at the Progressive Peninsula School for Creative Education in Menlo Park. The experience proved to be formative. She later recalled its impact on her, saying, "I had for some time been worrying the question of folk song, like a dog with a bone, and particularly I was curious about American folk songs. What was American about it? I knew only the Lomax cowboy songs," that's a reference to Lomax's book of that title, "and a few tunes from my parents, but I had been so struck by the wild enthusiasm and persistence engendered among the youngsters at the Peninsula School by Home on the Range that I was convinced that there was some special affinity between the character of this song and the youngsters who went after it so hard." This question of identity and music not only sparked Sidney's lifelong interest in folk music, it seems to have pulsed through her entire career. As we shall see later, it came to influence her work in Ireland. After divorcing her first husband, Kenneth Robertson, in 1934, Sidney moved from California to New York to serve as the director of the social music program at the Henry Street Settlement. And this was quite common during the Great Depression, that people would be so moved by the circumstances they were witnessing all around them to be socially minded. On the East Coast, she met Charles Seeger, who recruited her to be a music worker for the Resettlement Administration. Sidney then spent most of her 30s, according to Saylor, travelling alone throughout the United States collecting music from lumberjack camps, dance halls, and chain gangs. A fieldwork outing to North Carolina in 1936 with John A. Lomax and Frank C. Brown introduced her to unaccompanied melismatic singing, which, according to Topping, was a singing style that was to be the chief attraction for her in any folk or traditional music she heard thereafter. This, following her second marriage in 1941 to the well-known American avant-garde composer Henry Cowell, however, Sidney recorded little folk music. This makes her work of the 1950s, including her Irish work, all the more remarkable. It's a taste of what might have been had she continued to work through her marriage with Henry with the intensity of her youthful endeavours. So how exactly did Sidney come to record in Ireland, and specifically in Aran and in Conamara? Well, in 1955, she and Henry planned a lecture and concert tour of Europe and the Middle East. They began their trip with a holiday in Aran. They particularly wanted to meet Maggie Duran, the star of Man of Aran, whom Henry had met in New York in 1934 during the Broadway premiere of the film. Cowell and Flaherty were friends, and Flaherty had asked Cowell to chaperone the islanders while they were in the city. In June 1955, 21 years after that encounter, Sidney and Henry arrived in Inishmore to stay in my grandparents' guest house in Killivity. There, Sidney discovered that Maggie Duran's son, John, and Pádraig Bhrocha de Wallis and others had never been recorded. She said that she would return to Aran to record them if she could, though she was doubtful that would ever happen. But within a week of leaving, Sidney was back in Aran with an EMI tape recorder she borrowed from the BBC, with the help of her friend, the folk music and dance collector from England, Maud Carpeles. And as far as I can gather, they first met in 1950 in the States at a conference, and were inspired right after the conference to head off down to the Appalachian Mountains to sort of make it a revisiting trip of what Maud had done with Cecil Sharp in the 1914, 16, 18 period. So, over 12 days from the 11th to the 22nd of June, Sidney recorded 16 single-track tapes in Inishmore, around 70 songs, mostly in Irish and a few English ones, a little mouth music or lilting, accordion, harmonica, dancing, and keening, the Irish practice of lamenting the dead. In 1956, when she and Henry were granted funding by the Rockefeller Foundation to spend 7 months studying music in the Orient, a trip that encompassed the countries I named earlier, Sidney began that trip by returning to Ireland and recording 16 5-inch double-track tapes in Inishmore and Inishmore over 9 weeks, from June 12th to August 18th. In between her 2 Irish trips, she attended Irish language classes at Columbia University in New York to help her to better understand songs in Irish and in the closely related language of Scots Gaelic, having recorded the latter in Nova Scotia in 1950. And whilst in Ireland, it appears that she may well have attended an Irish language course at Colas de Chonacht in Spidal in Conamara in July 1956. That summer, however, her recording time was curtailed when her Magnemite recorder had to be shipped to the nearby city of Galway for repairs. She spent late August recording 11 5-inch double-track tapes in Corna in Conamara, and she planned to return to Ireland a year or two later for more Irish and English songs, but never did. In the beginning, Sidney's work in Ireland resembled that of her early work in the US, where in California, for instance, Kirst finds that Sidney recorded and was interested in recording what people were singing. No matter how popular or non-traditional these materials were, the range is quite broad. In Aran too, Sidney first sought music that was authentic to the locality, regardless of what form it took. However, that changed when she was drawn to one particular type of singing, sean-nós, or old-style singing, unaccompanied solo monophonic singing. That was then and is still regarded as native to Ireland. Sidney had never heard this kind of singing before, and she called it older, wilder music. She wrote, "It has been something of a surprise to me to find that the voices of many Irish peasants, like those of beggars and boatmen in Italy, are really surpassingly beautiful by cultivated concert standards, although they may sing nothing but songs from the oral tradition in the old curving vocal style, very surprising from a fellow in hip boots digging peat in a Conamara bog." So I'm going to play you an example of the music that she had in mind when she wrote that piece, if I can find it.
It's John McDonough of Art East Cavan. Today is the 13th of August 1956, and we're here in Conamara. Now Sean's going to sing for us a song named America, or in English, America. Now Sean.
Sidney was clearly very pleased and excited to be recording this unknown music, but there was another motive driving her work in Ireland besides her attraction to this style of singing, a motive concerning American folk music. Early on in her 1955 trip, she began to make some musical connections between Irish traditional music and American folk music. She was particularly keen to document such connections for an American audience because, as she wrote, the music lies very close behind much of the folk music of the United States, and because she believed, incorrectly as it happens, that there were no recordings of this Sean-nós material now in the US at all. She drew attention to the obvious melodic connections referencing the music she heard whilst collecting in the northern US, but she also became convinced of a stylistic connection between the folk musics of both countries. She connected the more embellished forms of Sean-nós singing that she heard in Aran and in Conamara, such as we just heard in that clip I played, with the melismatic singing she recorded almost 20 years earlier in America's South. It is unclear when exactly she came to this interesting conclusion, but the content of her collection suggests that this stylistic connection had become a concern for her at the very latest before she began recording in Ireland in 1956. So between 1955 and 1956, Sidney went from being a frontierswoman to a prospector. At the heart of her investigation was the question of identity and music that first came to her attention in California in the 1920s, and that piqued her interest in folk song. What was American about it? Her investigation into the Irish ancestry of American folk music was a search for American identity. As a motive for her work in Ireland, this one was at least as powerful as her wishes to record Sean-nós singing for her pleasure and for posterity. Ethnomusicologists and folklorists today might dismiss Sidney's theory of a stylistic connection between Irish Sean-nós and southern US folk singing as flawed, ill-conceived or impossible, a folly. Indeed, by 1957, Sidney herself appears to have lost some faith in it. However, regardless of its merit or demerit, it demonstrates an outstanding feature of her work and that of her generation of collectors, who were pre-television, pre-satellite, pre-YouTube. That is their openness. They were experiencing worlds of music for the very first time, in the flesh, with their own ears. They would have had less trouble entertaining such a theory, for a while at least, because their investigations, which regularly broke new ground, held the promise of possibility. In comparison with their Irish counterparts at least, contemporary American collectors, including Sidney, were particularly open to the possible. And Alan Lomax's Cantometrics project is probably the most dramatic and ambitious expression of that musical, cultural and human imagining. Their openness encouraged them to be omnivorous, insatiable scholars. Sidney recalled Charles Seeger's instructions to her were to record everything. Don't select, don't omit, don't concentrate on any single style. We know so little, record everything. Their openness also encouraged them to meet new standards of documentation that would reflect their respect for the world's musical cultures. Recording, Sidney wrote, is the only true way of knowing, preserving the knowledge of what native culture is in a form that can then be circulated with truth. It is their openness that makes the work of Sidney and her peers modern. Sidney's own vivid allegorical description of their efforts, which she presented in her first field report on her North Carolina trip of 1936, captures their modern sensibility as well as their sense of discovery. And here we are, struggling to make our own way into the main current of contemporary culture, which we conceive as dynamic and alive, drawing its force from 1,000 tributaries which flow forward with a perpetual meeting of the waters into the future. Sidney's entire collection of Aran recordings presents a good selection of what traditional music was practiced there in the mid-1950s and illustrates the diversity of the island's musical traditions. Her field notes tell us much about a contemporary soundscape that was in flux, as it assimilated influences from gramophones, radios, printed sources, and oral transmission that by then could stretch far across the Atlantic, thanks to returning emigrants. However, the Folkways album she produced, Songs of Aran, uses only the 1955 recordings and does not best represent the soundscape of Aran, or indeed the songs of Aran. It focuses more on the singing of Maggie and John Duran, and it avoids most of the English repertoire that was then steadily growing in Aran. It's unclear why exactly Sidney produced the album, but there is a suggestion that she wanted the Durans to earn some money for their recording efforts. She wrote in her diary that John Duran, or Sean as she called him, had been reluctant to record, but economic circumstances persuaded him to change his tune. She wrote, "There was much talk of the loss of a heifer, who should have brought £80 or so, all their cash for the year for the two households, and so when I asked again if Sean didn't want to sing, he smiled assent. Then I couldn't change tapes fast enough." The album may have been the first US release of Shannon's song, and the thought of providing such a record appears to have spurred Sidney. So I'm going to play you some clips of the music that Sidney recorded. The first is of John. Oh, sorry. Maggie, sorry. Okay. This is John. The man dancing is their friend and neighbour, Pádraig Rocha Zawalish. I'm going to just give you an example of John or singing as well. I'm blazing through these examples, sorry for want of time. And just finally, I'll play you the examples of maybe the two most significant recordings on the album, which are of Keening, or Conamara, of the Lament for the Dead. The Keens were recorded by Maggie and by Breed's Earnon. Maggie wasn't a professional keening woman, but Breed's had been, and by this time the practice was dying out, so the two women were prepared to record it because they realised that this was an opportunity to preserve the memory of the practice. So Maggie, though, to have keened without out of context was would have been taboo, so she requested that she remain anonymous on the album. And Breed's it didn't matter because she was a professional keener, so her name does appear on the album. Breeds, however, had fallen. I think she broke a hip or something, so her voice really wasn't as strong as it had been. So first Maggie's one and then Breeds' one.
Oh, ho, ho, no, it's so home and winding. Oh, ho, 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 no. Oh, ho, ho, no, it's so home, no, it's way winding. Ow, ow, oh. Ow, ow, oh. Yes, ow, 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 and winding.
So Breeds now.
Oh, no, it's oh, no.
I'll just stop that there. I'm going to turn to Alan Lomax now for a few minutes. And I'd like to thank Todd Harvey in particular for helping me get to grips with this collection in a very short space of time. Alan was born in Austin, Texas in 1915 and died in Safe Harbor, Florida in 2002. The title of John Schwed's biography of him captures his unique achievement. He was the man who recorded the world. I've included here the list of the countries in which he eventually recorded on this map, which you can find on the website of the Association for Cultural Equity, an organisation Alan himself founded to help preserve cultural equity, especially for cultures that are a minority or under threat of extinction. In achieving all of this, it helped that Alan started young. As a teenager, he joined his father, John A. Lomax, on his many music collecting trips throughout the US, especially in the South. And he was just 20 when he accompanied Zora Neale Hurston and Mary Elizabeth Barnacle on a collecting trip that eventually brought him overseas for the first time to the Caribbean. He and his father were at different times key figures in the early days of the Archive of American Folk Song here at the library. Now, just before I played my musical examples for you, I told you that Sidney's interest in providing the US with a commercial recording of Shanno's song, and which she eventually did in 1957, the same year in which Mo Ash published another shorter collection of Shanno's song he recorded from Sorcha ní Ruaidhrim of Roisin na Mainneach Conamara during her visit to New York in 1945. Well, it was a similar but much grander notion of providing listeners with such an opportunity, but on this occasion with a series of records, a world library of folk and primitive music, as it was termed at the time. And that's what led Alan to Ireland in 1951, 4 years before Sidney. The recent development of LPs, which could fit more songs onto a commercial record, made such dreams possible. From a chance meeting in a Broadway coffee shop with the president of Columbia Records late in the summer of 1950 came this 1955 release, Volume 2 in the series, Ireland. With characteristic unfettered ambition, Alan had proposed putting out records of music from up to 60 countries. Columbia suggested 30, and in the end, 18 out of a projected 44 were published. The series is nonetheless epic for that contraction. Lomax wasted little time and sailed to Europe, where he met with Robin Roberts in Paris. They agreed to begin the hunt for the world's music in Ireland, but with a supremely tight schedule, limited experience of Irish music, and equipment, a Magna Carta that sometimes failed them, they relied heavily on the cooperation and guidance of local authorities. In Ireland, these included the national radio station, Radio Éireann, and the Irish Folklore Commission, which had been, since the late 1920s and 1930s, amassing one of Europe's most prized archives of folklore. Both of these organisations were incarnated in the person of Seamus Ennis, who you can see here riding his bicycle. one of the most important figures in Irish traditional music in the 20th century. By then, he had nearly 10 years of experience collecting traditional music throughout much of Ireland. First for the Folklore Commission between 1942 and 1947, and he was using a bike because, of course, that's during the war, so fuel would have been scarce. And then then as an outside broadcast officer with the mobile recording unit of Radio Aran, which is where Lomax found him. This experience made Ennis an unparalleled source of information on where one might source traditional musicians worthy of contributing to Alan's World Library of Music. The fact that he was also talented, charming, handsome, and an exceptionally gifted musician, he's remembered most widely in Ireland as a wonderful uilleann piper, made him the ideal guide for Lomax's Irish foray. Lomax recorded the bulk of his Irish material in just 4 snowy weeks between the 13th of January and the 10th of February 1951. It's hard to resist characterising his visit without recalling James DeLargy's moniker for him. He called him the Texas Tornado. You can see from this map that they started in Dublin on the east coast and they travelled roughly sort of clockwise around the country. They headed once he'd recorded Ennis in Dublin until 3 or 5 a.m. or something, and then they drove in the mobile recording unit's van because the machine had broken, so they had to borrow the equipment. So this is an example of where the cooperation between all these different bodies was really crucial to the recordings being made. So they headed south to Muscree, and you can see that they headed to Gaeltachtaí as well. I think that's a significant point. In Muscree, they headed to Bess Cronin, who had an extraordinary repertoire of songs, and she was kind of getting on in years by the time they reached her. And she had been recorded on many occasions, so she was a likely contributor. And other people there, Maud and Nihulawan, Gobnitz, Nichronin, Diarmid O'Riordan, all down in that Gaeltach there, and in Ballylickey on the south coast. Then they moved up to Galway, and they were at times based either in Galway or Uachtarard, which is on the lake shore, and in Corna, way out on the west coast there, and one visit to Lochray to record Aggie White. And then straight up, no delay. Generally, the pattern was spending 1 or 2 days with people or in a locality, 1 or 2 visits with these contributors, recording maybe up to 10 songs, for instance, from Bess Cronin, and then moving on. So after they finished in the west, where they visited with Colm O'Keon, who was a friend of Seamus Ennis, he recorded or documented over 200 songs from Colm. So again, he was like the Galway version of Bess in the south. And then they headed north to Guidor and or Gurtachurke, and they tried to trace Mickey Doherty, the travelling fiddle player, and were playing a game of catch up, trying to catch him. Every time they arrived where they thought he was, he had moved on to the next place. And then on the route back down to Dublin, they stopped in Cavan, just that red dot in the middle there, to record Sean O'Conaiche, who was from Corna, but he was a teacher based in Cavan at the time. And then back to Dublin, and then gone, went back to London, and that was it. So the vast majority of those whom Alan recorded were people that had contributed to Ennis's work over the years. And Robin Roberts observed how Ennis's name and presence was an imprimatur that helped them to quickly gain access to performers. And she also observed how it helped to offset the ill effects of Alan's insistent style, which in 1950s Ireland sometimes made him seem comparatively loud or brash, and at worst, arrogant. The contrasts between Sidney's and Alan's respective work in Ireland demonstrate 2 very different methodologies. Sidney's collection of music of Aran and Conamara reads like a close study of a small locale. She had less recording time than Alan, just over 3 weeks, but she had more time in general, just over 2 months, in the field to dwell in the 3 communities to which she confined herself, to observe life and music making therein and to build relationships herself with potential contributors. And she also had to do these things because she travelled alone most of the time. She worked independently and without a publishing deadline hanging over her. Her concern was simply to gather and preserve what was best and most representative of what she sought. And the idea of publishing an album was, as we've seen, an afterthought. Alan, on the other hand, was on a mission when he came to Ireland, and Bob Dylan actually called him a missionary. He needed to survey a whole country of music for his World Library. With only 4 weeks in which to achieve his goal, he did not have very much time to court and cajole performers, so he needed some guarantee that his contributors could deliver the goods in a timely and quality fashion. And it's for this reason that he ended up following the Ennis Trail, as Nicholas Carlin describes, where Ennis led him to some of his star informants, including Colm O'Keehan and Sean O'Conaiche, the only two singers that both Alan and Sidney recorded. And it appears that Ennis suggested these remarkable performers to Alan and to Sidney, and was spurred to do so, no doubt, by the promise of enabling good performers to encounter the latest superior technology that these visitors brought into Ireland. Despite their different styles, methodologies and circumstances whilst working in Ireland, there are some commonalities between Alan's and Sidney's work there. They're sometimes unreliable new machines, and their identities as foreigners and as Americans gave them mystique and prestige that encouraged performers to oblige their requests for contributions to the tape. After their long years of experience in the US, they also had sufficiently well-developed fieldwork instincts to guess at the significance of a mindful contribution like Sean Chuile MacDonough's rendition of Seachrain Chearúil. Sidney guessed rightly that it was old, but could not have imagined its medieval roots. Or for Alan to press Bess Cronin into delivering a particularly long version of Lord Gregory. Supreme performers like these, and like Mickey Doherty, for instance, recognised that Alan was someone who could give his bewitching art the time and space it deserved. Mickey was comfortable enough to make Alan recall the recording session with him as the best day in Ireland. One final observation of common ground between the two is the fact that they were both interested in the roots of American music as it occurred in Ireland. Nevertheless, they had their own slightly different reasons for pursuing that particular investigation. And as much as I'd like to get into that, I have to end my brief comparison of Alan and Sidney there, but you can see how such comparisons help to highlight the strengths and weaknesses of various collectors and their collections, and to contextualise their respective merits and demerits. So with the time I've left, I want to briefly contextualise Sidney's achievements. She that's a bit more marginalised. The most important attribute of her work is undoubtedly its good quality. Saylor writes that in America she was among the earliest collectors to employ the use of extensive note-taking, a field technique that gives her work an integrity notable in its time. Her Irish field notes give invaluable insight into the conditions of recording, performance and musical practices in Aran and in Conamara, while at the same time trying to place those practices in a global context, an achievement that contemporary Irish collectors could not match for want of experience, skill or resources. And when her tape machine didn't let her down, the recordings were generally good too. Her method of collecting in Ireland was ethical, thorough, understanding and ultimately modern. She's to be commended in particular for her valuable documentation of keening, because for many Irish people, the notion of documenting this funerary ritual, and especially of recording it, would have been taboo. And regardless of the merit or demerit of her theory about a connection between Irish and southern US folk singing, Sidney's willingness to consider such a connection demonstrates one of her outstanding characteristics as a collector of folk music and an ethnomusicologist, and that is her fearlessness, her courage. Amidst other collectors of Irish music in Ireland, Sidney stands out not just for the quality of her work, but also for being a pioneer, a woman and an American. She was a pioneer because she was the first person to go to the Aran Islands to record music. Up until 1972, when Radio na Gaeltachta, the local radio station, was founded, few collectors documented Aran music. By then, only 3 other parties had visited Aran specifically to collect music. So Sidney's recordings are among the earliest we have of Aran's marginalised soundscape. Sidney was a woman in a male-dominated field of folk music collecting, and the story of female music collectors in 1950s Ireland, including Sidney, Jean Ritchie and Diane Guggenheim, who significantly were all American, has yet to be fully considered, although in March of last year, Nicholas Carlin of the Irish Traditional Music Archive did give a lecture on the subject in a showing. In Aran, being a woman may have helped Sidney to gain access to and record the strictly female art of keening, but she succeeded in a male environment too, for example in Fitz's pub in Killéna. Sidney's success in recording both male and female musicians was due to her personality and her way with people more than to her being a woman, but it's also a reflection of of the generally positive attitude of contemporary Aran society towards female visitors. So in conclusion, Sidney's Irish collection indicates that she was a diligent, conscientious, tenacious and talented collector with a modern methodology. Viewed in the context of her earlier work in America, her Irish collection suggests her modern methodology was relatively consistent up until 1956 at least. However, we await studies of her other overseas work to see if it persisted beyond that or throughout her entire career. Initial evidence from her work in the other foreign countries suggests that she seems simply to have recorded whatever traditional music was current there. But during her collecting trip in Canada in 1953, when she recorded an Irishman named Jim Gannon, who had emigrated from Mayo, she may have done so in the hope that his songs might provide the kind of evidence she later sought in Ireland. I don't know, I'm waiting to hear from my Canadian compatriots to hear what they make of that particular intriguing detour. Other questions that future researchers might investigate further include: how does the entirety of Sidney's international work compare with that of Alan Lomax? And how exactly did her strong ethical stance affect the work of her contemporaries, including Alan? The quality and overall consistency of the work examined here suggests that Sidney's entire oeuvre certainly deserves more attention. It encourages us to consider other American collectors who worked in Ireland, including Alan Lomax, Jean Ritchie and George Picot, Diane Guggenheim, Artelia Court and Ruth Vile Bigsby, to name a few. And it also encourages us to consider the work of women collectors who've been marginalised in the history of folk music collecting and ethnomusicology. I, for one, look forward to hearing more about this collector, whom Jim Leary has described as a politically engaged, independent-minded, anything but naive, spunky new woman. Sinead, thank you very much. I'd like to invite any questions or comments, and I will repeat them for the sake of the webcast. Nothing. I can play you another musical example if you like. I'm not quite sure what's next on the playlist, but we can find out whilst you're thinking. Let's find out. Oh. So what you're listening to here is Sean Choile MacDonagh, and he's performing Seachrain Chearúil, The Wanderings of Carol. And the form is the older form I was talking about. It's medieval. So I'll just stop him for a second not to be talking across him. This is a sort of, as I say, a medieval survival, and that particular recording, that whole day that Sidney spent with that family is really the best part of her collecting. And she describes it wonderfully in her diary how she went to this house, I think I have a picture of it somewhere, in Corna, and it was Sean Choile MacDonagh and 4 of his 12 children, all singing songs. And she describes how they came in, they sat down, heads back, and just started singing. They said you could like it or lump it. This was their music and they liked it. So I think apart from the fact that it shows the strength of the singing tradition in that community at the time, I think it's also a reflection of how well she managed to insert herself into the community, and that they felt that although she couldn't understand all of the words, despite all of her studying Irish, and she said she could understand a fair amount. They kind of identified her as somebody who appreciated it and whose heart was in the right place, and also had the time to sit there and take, I think it's 7 songs from Sean Cullum. There's like 3 or 4 each from each of his children. There's a ream of tapes from that particular one. So that's the Sean's thing. He sings a few verses, and then it goes from a sung verse into spoken runs, and then back in, it's like patter, and then back into the verses again. So until somebody has a question, I can just play that in the background. Hang on a sec. Another verse. He had an audience for this as well, and the funnier parts of the performance, it's lovely to hear them enjoying it and laughing along, and I think it's one of the best recordings of his performance of that. There's another one that's in the RTE archives, but I think this one has far more life and energy in it. So we got a question from Steve.
Well, I was just wondering, hearing that, whether, I mean, I know that there's still a sort of fabula tradition in Ulster that you sometimes hear. I wonder if there's a relation there, the Irish language and English language traditions.
I'm not as familiar. Okay, the question is there a relation between the Irish tradition there of the Crossanthacht and one in Ulster? But I'm not familiar with the one in Ulster, so I can't comment on that, unfortunately. But we'll talk about that later.
I think we have time for maybe 2 questions.
Okay, Alan?
Well, I'm fascinated by your exploring her manner in the field, and I think that's very important. And contrasting it with Alan Lomax was also very interesting. But I think you made an interesting observation about Lomax's style, which was absolutely very aggressive and pushy, that he also managed to convey to some musicians, at least, that this was the most important moment in the world, that I'm recording you here. And there was something about his conveying of how urgent and important it was that I think permitted him to get away with that aggressiveness, sometimes anyway. So, just a comment.
Okay, which I might summarise for the webcast, just on Alan's eagerness in the field. I think his enthusiasm for the work that he was doing was, he could not help himself. He was just consumed by this project, and as you say, I think I think a lot of performers who contributed to his work would have forgiven him a lot, realising that ultimately, you know, they shared the same goal, which was to preserve that which he was recording. So, thanks. And Simon. Simon here.
I have a couple of questions. One is just very briefly, you ended on saying, quoted someone saying, her political engagement. And I'm just curious to know what more you can say about that and how that impacted on the way in which she went about her collecting. And the second question is, listening to excerpts of the music, which is just wonderful, I'm just struck by how the impossibility of notating that accurately. And I just wondered whether her and other people of Lomax's recordings, how that has influenced the attempts to record it, say, in the 19th century, which obviously would have been purely by writing it down, notating it that way, how these recordings have influenced a reassessment of how those songs and that music was recorded through notation in the 19th century.
Oh, okay, so for the webcast, there's it's a two-part question. The first, as to Sidney's political engagement, I mentioned that she was inspired during the Great Depression and that which she saw happening all around her in America to do something and make herself useful. I think she wrote that she felt she had been quite privileged, or that she was in a, very comfortable kind of life, and thought maybe I should do something and contribute to American society. So that is very common for the period, and a lot of women as well got into social work, or maybe they came through social work and ended up in folk music. I know Jean Ritchie worked in the Henry Street settlement as well after Sidney. So the political engagement is of the epoch in a way. It's of that time, and a lot of these collectors, they would have been. I'm not saying that where their politics lay, but they were interested in sort of in society, and that Alan, as it happens, was. He was in Europe avoiding McCarthyism here, and the FBI were following him, MI5 were following him, and they never found conclusive evidence that he was a communist. So the second part of your comment, which was on the impossibility of transcribing the kind of music you heard there, yeah, it's still impossible, and I think now people are always glad to find more and more recordings. So this kind of work of trying to turn up recordings and retrieve them is really valuable, because those of us working with older sources treasure any sort of hint that tries to bring to life what otherwise are just dots on a page. So, for instance, yesterday I figured out that there was a recording that Alan had made of a particular performance by Bess Cronin that people weren't necessarily aware of, and it's quite valuable in that it ties in with the keening I played, in that Bess's repertoire, being so extraordinary, also had a lot of remnants, or it's an amazing source for somebody who's trying to find older forms of music. So now we have a recording that Alan made that has more verses in it that weren't in the other recordings. So it's all just, the more documentation we can pull together and the more we can connect it as well, it's the better off everyone is. Thank you.
Thank you. I think my colleague Jason Steinauer would like to say a few words.
Sorry.
Thanks, Deirdre.
Thank you guys very much for coming. We just want to acknowledge our partners in the library here in the American Folklife Center for helping us with this event, helping to promote it. Their attendant, Steve Winnick, introducing. So please, the American Folklife Center. And we here at the Kluge Center and the American Folklife Center, we do fascinating programs like this nearly every week, if not every month. Or I should say every month, if not every week. So please do sign up for our RSS feeds. Those are the best ways to learn about different programs that we have. You can sign up on the library's homepage, loc.gov, for all different RSS feeds about different events, and also when this webcast will go up online, that will also go out on our RSS feed. So thank you again for coming, and thanks again to Deirdre and the American Folklife Center, and have a good rest of the day.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.